Before we get started, just remember you are watching today for free via YouTube, so thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions during today's live presentation, be sure to type your question into the YouTube chat bar, and I'll be monitoring those throughout the live presentation. If you have questions for our presenter, or if you have technical issues, make sure to type your question in there, and we'll get back to you. Also, if you would like to receive CECs after today's presentation has concluded, be sure to use the link provided on your screen. That's acefitness.org/past webinars. We'll talk more at the end of today's live presentation about how to earn your CECs after watching. All right, if you're ready for today's course, let's get started. Welcome to your course, Weight Management, Changing Behaviors to Change Lives. My name is Jackie Crockford, and I will be your host for today's presentation. Joining me today is our presenter, Dominique Adair. Dominique.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Excellent, how are you?
Good, good. So thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
You have been a friend of ACE for a long time.
I have.
Yes,
That's
and
right.
We are welcoming you here this week as a presenter and also as a member of our scientific advisory panel.
Exactly.
Right?
I feel like this is ACE week.
Yes, yay. So tell us a little bit about the scientific advisory panel for those watching and a little bit about your role.
Sure. So the Scientific Advisory Panel is a group of health and wellness professionals. We get together about once a year, but share information throughout the year. Kind of ACE's eyes and ears out there to evaluate research, to take a look at trends, to help demythify or get rid of or sort of address some of the non-factual information, as well as bring up and bring to all of our attention some of the evidence-based information in health and wellness. So a great group to be a part of, and we're meeting this week.
Great. So you act as, on that panel, as a registered dietitian, kind of bringing in information from the nutrition world. And today we're going to be talking with you from your lens as a registered dietitian, but in the area of weight management with a behavior change.
That's right. That's right. So that is what I do. I've spent several decades in the field working with clients and sharing with colleagues like you the science of behavior change, or what it's all about, how we can help people make changes, behavior changes for weight management. That's the topic.
Great. So a lot to get over and cover this hour, so let's get started.
Excellent. Thanks, Jackie. Okay. So I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. We all know that behavior change is tough. It's something that I have spent decades of my career focusing on, and I actually still consider myself a student of behavior change. I will bring some of that learning to you today. We will share it together and consider this the beginning of our dialogue and our continued exploration into what makes people able to change their behavior. You know, for years I've thought, wouldn't it be great if we could just figure out what it is that sort of flips that switch in people? Why does it appear easier for some people to make behavior change than for others? And I think we don't really know exactly. There's probably no single answer, but today we'll spend an hour exploring some of the social science research, some of the tactical approaches and coaching sort of strategies around helping people change their behavior. And once again, I thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at the start of the hour at the objectives for the course. So I turn your attention to the slide, and the learning objectives for this course include learning about metabolic and behavioral contributors to overweight and obesity, evaluating weight loss programs based on their efficacy and the academic or scientific evidence to support them, implementing meaningful behavior change initiatives that support healthy weight management, and finally, how do we as coaches and health and wellness and fitness professionals, incorporate those behavior change strategies into our client and class member relationships. So those are the objectives, and let's get started. Lots to cover. We're going to start off with some definitions, some criteria. We'll address some of the health risks, and then look at some population health statistics that really give us an alarming idea of the size of this problem globally. So let's get started with some definitions of underweight, healthy weight, overweight, and obesity. So we've all probably heard of BMI, right, or body mass index. And the slide kind of gives you a good, reliable definition. It's a relationship of height to weight as a statistical predictor of morbidity and mortality. Well, that's kind of a mouthful. What does it mean? It's the equations are on the slide, so the linear math is fairly simple. Whether we're looking at metric or imperial measurements, it's somebody's weight divided by their height squared. And then in the case of pounds and inches, you multiply that out by 703. But really what we're looking at is a single number, right? BMI is a single number that represents somebody's relationship of their height to their weight. And we know from loads of population research that that BMI is aligned with disease risk. And we'll take a look in a few slides at what those diseases actually are. But let's take a look at the next slide, which will show you BMI categories and then what that BMI actually looks like plotted on a graph. So you can see the left side of your slide shows BMI categories. So you've got underweight, healthy weight, overweight, and then obesity, which is then we further divide into subclasses of obesity. On the right side of your slide, you see that that's a J curve. So you can see the lowest point in that J, that actually represents the BMI where people are at a healthy weight, so their lowest risk for disease. But remember that definition that we just looked at. It's a statistical predictor of morbidity and mortality as it relates to the height-weight relationship. So you can see that J curve goes up on the right side as the BMI increases from overweight to obesity. So some of those diseases, and we'll look at a more inclusive list in a few slides, are things like diabetes, right? Coronary artery disease, even chronic kidney disease are on that list. So as BMI goes up, the risk for those diseases increase. While not the topic of today's conversation, you can also see that there's an increase on the low end. So we don't want people to be underweight. That increases their risk for morbidity, risk for disease, and mortality, risk for death. But we're addressing today how to help people with behavior change so that they don't end up on the right side of that J curve. There are other metrics that we use. You'll see them a lot in research, and you'll certainly see them in the conversation around insurance. And they're often used for populations, but sometimes we use them with individuals. One of them is on your screen right now. The waist to hip ratio is calculated by taking weight and dividing it by hips. So we use it as a measurement, again, of health or an indicator risk for developing conditions. And to think about it, I'm a visual learner, so to think about it visually, we're looking at people that have apple-shaped bodies, so central deposition of body fat, being at greater risk for things like diabetes and heart disease than people with pear-shaped bodies. And the waist to hip ratio gives us that information. We also look at a single measurement, just waist circumference. It's gender specific, so the cut points are there on your screen, right? A waist circumference of 40 inches or more for men or 35 inches or more for women actually represents an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and high blood pressure. And the last slide we'll look at actually goes over some of those health risks that we talked about. So it's loading up onto the slide. You can see it's type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease and stroke, certain types of cancer, sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, chronic kidney disease, and pregnancy and fertility problems. So what you're probably thinking is, well, wait a second, isn't there some overlap here? And you're absolutely right. You know, we know that high blood pressure and diabetes, for example, are primary risk factors for kidney disease. We know that diabetes and heart disease are almost entirely overlapping at this point in terms of cardiometabolic or cardiovascular disease driven by metabolic dyslipidemia. So there are definitely interrelationships between these health risks, but what we do know from the research available is whether we're using BMI, waist-hip ratio, waist circumference, waist to height ratio is another one, is that those cut points all do indicate to us, help us risk stratify, right? Whether somebody is at greater risk for developing these diseases. But I caution us against using a single measurement, right? BMI, for example, was developed over 100 years ago. Well, this was before we had Bluetooth scales, right? And some of the advanced technology that we now have to assess body composition. So we know that things like really any of these measurements do have limitations, and that should caution us from using any single metric to risk stratify or define somebody as overweight or obese. But if we use a number of them, and you'll see in the slide coming up, it actually looks at BMI as it relates to waist circumference. If we use a number of them, along with all of the other more advanced technologies that we have available to us today, we can determine, is somebody overweight, are they obese, and what can we do to help them achieve a healthier weight? So this is that slide I just mentioned. What you can see on the left-hand side are the BMI categories: underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese, and then the subclasses of BMI in terms of obesity. And then throughout the graphic, you can see that it actually relates to waist circumference. So encouraging us not to look at one single metric as a way of determining, okay, your BMI says X and therefore you're obese, because we all know, especially in the fitness community, that BMI doesn't take into account body composition, right? It almost treats us as two-dimensional bodies, and we know that we can have a obese bodybuilder. So we want to be cautious about using them, be aware of the limitations, but I invite you to read a lot of the research that does use these cutoffs, and just be aware that there's good literature that aligns these metrics with death and disease risk. So let's take a look at what those statistics are in terms of prevalence and frequency out in the world population. So I turn your attention to the bullets on the slides. We know that worldwide obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. What that means simply is that it's going in the wrong direction, right? It hasn't even leveled off, and we're certainly not in a pattern of reversing this trend towards overweight and obesity. In 2016, which is the last set of really good, reliable data that we have globally, close to 2 billion adults, right, 18 years and over, were overweight, and of those, 650 million, subset, right, were obese. Most of the world's population live in countries where overweight and obesity kills more people than underweight. A century ago, we were battling diseases of caloric insufficiency or nutrition insufficiency. Right now, we're actually looking at diseases in most of the developed world that have to do more with surplus than deficiency. And so it has changed our public health focus. An enormous part of that involves you guys. And I'm thrilled that you're tuning in today, because as the next slide will show you, I do believe that obesity is preventable. Difficult, challenging, tough, but preventable, and we are all a part of that solution. So you can see from the bullets on this slide that this is specific to children, 41 million children under the age of 5 were obese in 2016, 340 million children and adolescents, so that age group between 5 and 19, were overweight or obese. And as I just mentioned, if there's an important take-home message from the conversation that we've had thus far, it's that obesity is preventable. We will look at influences. We will look at genetics. We will look at a difficult environment. We'll look at hormones that all contribute to whether somebody ends up a healthy weight or not. But I want us to keep reminding ourselves and reminding our colleagues, because this can be tough work to do, that obesity is preventable, and that through understanding behavior change and supporting behavior change, we can help people actually prevent obesity. Let's take a look at some of those contributors. Let's take a look a little bit more closely at, I mentioned genetics and hormones and the environment. Let's take a look at some of those contributors, because unless we sort of understand what the influence is, it becomes hard for us to develop a paradigm or an approach or tactics behind helping people change that behavior. So we're going to first look at genetic influences. Your slide details with 3 bullets that children of obese parents are more likely to become obese. That effect is what we call polygenic, and what that means is that there's probably not one single gene, as there is for some other diseases. Remember, obesity is a disease in and of itself, despite the comorbidities. There probably isn't a single gene. You know, in genetics, we're able to measure what's called SNPs, or single nucleotide proteases, and we're even able to sequence an entire gene. Well, in the world of obesity and genetics, we haven't really found one gene. We've said, aha, this single gene is what creates a predisposition to obesity. What polygenic means is that it's probably small variants in multiple genes, none of which can be overtly measured, that together contribute to predisposing somebody to obesity. And the other interesting sort of component to the genetic contribution to obesity is that these genes are what we call phenotypic or phenotypical. That means that they will be expressed in a certain environment. And that environment, as you can well imagine, is one of high stress, suboptimal food choices, too little exercise or too little activities, sedentary lifestyle. And so maybe the gene is there, it's just waiting for the perfect, imperfect but perfect, right, opportunity to express itself. And so a lot of the genetic research that I'm fascinated by is twin studies, because you might be saying to yourself, sure, kids, like the slide says, of obese parents are more likely to become obese. But how much of that is shared genetics and how much of that is shared environment? Those kids with those parents are also growing up, for the most part, in those environments. And that's why twin studies are fascinating, where they actually look at monozygotic or different types of twins that are raised in different environments. And what they find, as you can imagine, is that the genetic influence is still very, very strong. Where we're cautious about sharing that information is that we don't want anybody to wave the white flag, right? We don't want anybody to say, oh my goodness, mom is this way and dad is this way and I've been dealt this hand, and so, that I sort of have no hope. We don't want people to do that. But I'll share with you a story of a client that I had early on in my career. And she came in and we were doing a comprehensive medical health history, which involved a family health history. One, I needed to know more about her risk for developing diseases that are related to hereditary influences, but I also just sort of want to know where she was coming from, right? And she said that her mother had type 2 diabetes, she was currently on insulin, and she was on a cocktail of high blood pressure medications, antihypertensives. And her dad had premature heart disease, and he had a heart attack and quadruple bypass at age 54, which certainly qualifies him for premature heart disease. So needless to say, she was dealt sort of a lousy hand, if you will, genetically. And the way she described it to me was this. She said, I see that whole list that we just looked at a few slides ago. I see all of these risks, and I see them in my kind of genetic history or these hereditary influences. And she described it to me this way. She said, I think of it as a light switch that's off. And through modifiable behavior change and healthy behaviors, managing stress, moving a healthy amount, making healthy food choices, she felt that she could keep that switch off forever. That was pretty powerful for me to hear, right? She could choose, or behavior could cause her to flip the switch on and say, come here diabetes, come here hypertension, come here heart disease, come get me. Or in her words, not mine, she could choose to keep that switch off forever. And that is sort of a reference to now what we are calling phenotypical, right? She acknowledged the environment. She just chose not to have those genetics express themselves. And she felt powerful in her behavior and her behavior change to make sure that didn't happen. Let's take a look at some of the hormonal influences, because this is in part tied to genetics, right? This neurobiological environment is controlled to some degree by genetics, but there are other things that control our hormones, and the better we understand them, the better we understand how that impacts weight deposition and fat deposition and versus obesity, the better we will be able to help people. So on the slide you can see I've listed some hormones like leptin. We know that appetite satiety set of hormones, ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone, even sounds like it makes you hungry. Leptin is the feel full hormone. We've got insulin at play there. We've got estrogens and androgens. Androgens get converted in women to estrogen. Adipocytokines like adiponectin, which is actually a hormone made by the fat cells. That's cardioprotective. It actually prevents us from getting diabetes. So what I'm suggesting is there's all of this complex feedback set of hormones that contribute to whether we end up with excess weight or not. I'm going to read directly from the slide because I think that this language is important. It says dysregulation may lead to abnormal metabolism and the accumulation of body fat. So dysregulation causes obesity, and obesity causes dysregulation. And you can already see there's sort of a cycle, right, or circle here where obesity causes this hormonal sort of stew, if you will, causes obesity, causes a hormonal stew, and it sort of circles back on itself in a way that is not that's challenging. And so when we're asking somebody to influence their behavior, change their behavior, we're actually asking them to sort of push against some of this neurobiological environment that might be going on. And of course, there's the environment. We could probably talk all day, right, about the environment. I go into a drugstore for shampoo, and the first 9 aisles I go through are cookies and crackers and chips and cookies and candy, and what I'm looking for in a drugstore is shampoo. So we know that there's a prevalence of high fat, high calorie, I'd add high sugar, palatable, convenient, and inexpensive foods. We also know that because of a number of influences, people are probably not moving as much as they should. And even with revised guidelines and re-revised guidelines and re-revised guidelines, we still find a huge challenge in getting our people to move as much as is in their best interest for health and well-being. Part of this actually might be associated with that last bullet, right? People are extremely stressed. They are in this constant sort of state of semi-alert, whether it's too many work hours or, I mean, the conversation around stress also could be in and of itself a webinar. But we know that that constant state of stress, because of its influence on neuropeptide Y and some interleukins and serotonin and cortisol and adrenals, also predisposes the body to fat accumulation. So you've got people eating more and stuff that's not necessarily so great. You've got them moving less, and then you've got them completely stressed about the entire situation, which only encourages fat deposition. And the next slide actually shows a graphic of what that looks like in a circle that I think is important to acknowledge. This circle, guys, it doesn't really start or stop anywhere, right? It's a circle. So we don't necessarily have to start at one point and end at a point. It's just something that kind of circles around on itself. Increased intake, decreased activity, the genetic contributors we talked about, phenotypic expression or kind of turning on those genes, compound it with stress, compound it with increased intake. You know, you just keep going around and around and around. And I could argue that there's a bi-directional arrow between any of those two blocks, right? Any of those two contributors, they sort of feed back on themselves. And stress causes expression, expression causes stress, and activity causes increased intake, and increased intake can cause decreased activity, so that you just end up in a behavioral and biological cycle that is extremely difficult for people to get out of. So how are they going to get out of it? We're going to use the remaining time together and talk about behavior change. We've outlined the problem. We've looked at some metrics and ways of defining it. We've looked at population statistics and some of the influences. Well, if it's not clear already, it's tough, right? Behavior change is really, really tough. So tough that social scientists about 60, 70 years ago started to actually formalize their examination of what influences behavior, right? Moving away from the sort of just do it, sort of approach to having people adopt healthier behaviors, scientists sat around and scratched their heads and said, why are they smoking when they know it's bad for them? Right? Why are we eating too much stuff when we don't feel good and it causes us to put on weight? Why are we drinking too much or not exercising in any healthy behavior when we know it's bad for us? And social scientists sat down and came up with a number of theories. And we're not going to spend time on each and every one here in the webinar, but I do encourage you at the end of today's presentation, we have slides that have references. And I made sure that in those references were some more detailed information about each of these models or theories. So the health belief model, the theory of planned behavior model, diffusion of innovation theory, sort of the trend theory. Why do people follow trends? Social cognitive theory and social norms theory. Do we do things alone in isolation or as part of a social network or a social fabric? And trans theoretical model, where we'll spend a little time together diving a little bit deeper. But all of these, the take home on this slide should be, wow, this is complicated. And social scientists are studying it and formalizing it in a way that should convince us that the work that we do is important, but not without complexity. So we're going to spend a few of the next slides looking at the trans theoretical model. It's also called the stages of change model. And I think the focus here, if this is new for you, what I really want you to remember is that the model is built on this concept that there is a readiness for change, that people come to us at varying degrees of being ready to change. And when I first started learning about this and went through some coaching programs myself that focused on TTM, or the stages of change model, I realized, wow, not only might I not be effective, let's say I came to somebody and I assumed that they were ready to get going and they were sort of in that action phase, we'll get to that in a second, and I sort of flooded them with information and tactics and strategies and tricks and tools. What I might be doing not only is not being effective, but I might actually be doing more harm than good, which is an alarming thought when we all got into this field to help people. So let's take a look at what those stages of change are, what they mean, and a little bit of discussion about how to recognize them in the people that that we find ourselves with. So you can see them there on the slide. We've got pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And people are on this sort of spectrum, if you will, when they come to us. And by way of example, somebody in pre-contemplation is somebody that, maybe they've heard that healthy eating and exercise is good for you, but they don't plan to do it, right? I've heard people say, you know what, you got to die of something. That's somebody that's in pre-contemplation. They're simply not ready for change. Right? If I take that person, I give them a meal plan, and I talk to them about high-intensity interval training, and that's going to do absolutely no good with that person. They are not in a place, their readiness to change is not ready for that information, right? Whereas somebody in contemplation, and it's hard to assign sort of time windows to these, but just to give you some relative idea, somebody in contemplation, somewhere around 6 months, they're thinking about, okay, I know what these behaviors are that'll help me achieve a healthy weight. I'm applying them to myself, but I'm not ready to do it yet, right? I'm just thinking about it. I'm just considering it. But they are applying those behaviors to themselves. They're thinking about what life might be like if they couldn't do this anymore, and instead they had to replace it with this. That's somebody that's in contemplation. The next stage, preparation, is somebody that's really getting ready to go. They're maybe even making plans for, once X date happens. I do a lot of smoking tobacco cessation work, and there's a lot of planning based on dates. Once this date happens, I'm going to put these things into place. I'm going to start in the world of healthy weight achievement. I'm going to start shopping for healthier foods, or I'm going to stop going to drive-thrus, or whatever that behavior actually is. They are actually preparing to move those behaviors into their world. And action is exactly what it sounds like. They're in action. They're doing it. They're following some of those behaviors. They're taking their lunch to work, right? They are going to meet with you, a trainer, twice a week. And they might even, in action, be expanding those behaviors outside of what was originally thought. So not only are they bringing their lunch to work, but they're shopping on Sundays so that they can food prep over the weekend so that they have food to take for the entire week. So that's what action looks like. And action is a wonderful place for us to get in there with some of the techniques and strategies that we'll talk about in a few slides and really reinforce that behavior change, because that's what we're seeing in front of us and we can be a part of. And maintenance is sort of what it sounds like, but be aware that maintenance doesn't mean done, right? They've certainly been in action again for about 6 months. Those behaviors have started to feel less new or less strange. The old behaviors feel more distant, but we can't kid ourselves that somebody that's in maintenance actually is vulnerable to relapse, right? And something very simple like the change of seasons, right? They have an exercise program, it involves exercising outside, they love being outside, all of a sudden it gets cold or too warm, and that exercise program gets pushed aside and the whole thing starts to fall apart. So we shouldn't consider our people in maintenance done. You're sort of never done, I guess. But we can consider that the healthy behaviors start to feel more habitual and they have replaced on a fairly regular basis those behaviors that were less healthy. So those are the stages of change. Next time somebody comes up to you and says, I'd like to work with you on weight loss, and I hear you are the coach or the trainer that can really help me, lose 20 pounds. Think about, explore a little bit, have a discussion. Are they in pre-contemplation or contemplation? Are they sort of there but not there? It doesn't mean don't work with them, right? It just means setting up those expectations for yourself and maybe even for them based on where they are in this readiness to change, in the stages of change model. I love this quote. This is from Jim Prochaska, a colleague of mine, who was one of the co-developers of the trans-theoretical model. And he says, the only real mistake you can make in changing is to give up on your ability to change. That's important. That's important for us to remember and reinforce in the people that we work with. And it's certainly important for our clients to remember that change is possible. So the trans-theoretical model is a model of behavior change. Motivational interviewing is a coaching sort of technique or approach is a better word that helps us take somebody or take the voyage with them from wherever they are on that stage of change to the next place. So let's take a look. There's 4 sort of pillars of motivation or principles of motivational interviewing that are important. And I turn your attention to the slide. We want to help people express empathy. We want to help them develop discrepancy, to roll with resistance, and that's us as coaches, and also to support self-efficacy. And so let's take a look at each one of those as principles of motivational interviewing, which is in support of some of what we've learned about stages of change. So let's look at express empathy. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's, I am walking in your shoes, right? I know how tough this is. I'm not telling you, just do it. Right? I'm not banging you over the head with some super rigorous exercise program that is very far from kind of where you are mentally or physically. I am on your side. And what's key to all of these principles is that it's a client-centered approach. It's not teacher and student, right? It's me and you in a collaborative relationship figuring out what's going to be required in this behavior change process. And by expressing empathy, you're on their side. And that rapport is invaluable. I would say it really sets the stage for anything that we're going to be talking about for the rest of today's discussion. Developing discrepancy is interesting. So developing discrepancy is about exploring the ambivalence or the discrepancy between the old behaviors and the goals. So in the context of today's discussion, people want to achieve a healthier weight, and for many people this involves losing some weight or a lot of weight, and yet they have this whole set of behaviors. They're eating foods that aren't really designed to help support somebody's weight loss, or they're not moving enough, they're completely stressed out, they're not sleeping enough, all that stuff. And developing discrepancy is about sort of exploding that ambivalence. And when I first started doing a lot of coaching, I was sort of afraid of doing that. I was afraid of looking at those behaviors that weren't supportive of somebody's goals, because I thought, well, maybe if we just don't talk about it, right? Maybe if we just sort of push them aside. I certainly didn't want to focus on them, but actually developing discrepancy is the opposite. It's about looking at that conflict. This is where I want to be. This is what's currently happening. Those two things are sort of mutually exclusive, and exploring that ambivalence. And what happens is the client ends up, through this exploration, developing from the inside a solution that's extremely potent, much more so than if you sort of didn't talk about that stuff, gave them a handout, and told them this is what they need to do. So don't be afraid to explore that ambivalence. If anything, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised in realizing that through facing it head on, it will, you in partnership with them, help guide them towards coming up with the solution themselves, which is a big part of what motivational interviewing is about. Rolling with resistance is making sure that you're staying in partnership or collaboration with the client. So even when, and this inevitably happens, when some of the behavior change isn't happening as fast as you'd like it to, or there's a little bit of relapse, instead of sort of getting back in that teacher-student relationship and sort of saying, you said you were going to, and I thought we had agreed, and almost taking it personally, instead you roll with resistance. When they say, oh, I couldn't exercise, and I ate terrible foods, and I'm completely stressed out and didn't meditate even though you told me to, say, I get it. I get it. Those things are really hard. And a little trick that I'll share with you when I'm sort of listening to myself as a coach, whenever I hear myself saying, yeah, but you said you were going to, or yeah, but didn't we make a meal plan? Or yeah, but you weren't going to go to 4 parties this weekend, you were going to choose. Whenever I hear yeah, but, I know that I've all of a sudden put myself on opposite sides from that client, and that's not where I want to be. Right? That's not expressing empathy, and I sort of think of the visual of you want to be dancing with them, not fighting with them. So if you're going into the ring and you start to kind of tussle with them, try to hang back and realize that you're probably not going to force them into behavior change. It just doesn't work that way. And if you can reestablish yourself as a collaborator, as a partner, you will enable that behavior change to happen much more successfully. And supporting self-efficacy, the last bullet on our slide, is about believing in them, believing in themselves. So it's not cheerleading, it's not rah-rah, you can do this. It's certainly not anything that feels insincere, but it's a true belief in their belief that they can change. And that comes across sometimes in some extremely subtle ways. So you have to kind of dig deep as a coach and really think about whether you believe that they can believe in themselves and whether you believe in them. And supporting that self-efficacy using language, and we'll start to explore in the next slide something called ORs, which are real kind of interactional tactics that we can use to do these things that we've been talking about. That we communicate to them, we believe in you and we believe in you believing in yourself. So let's take a look at ORs. This slide goes over the acronym, and it tells us what O, A, R, S, and plus actually stand for. And then we'll take a couple of slides to dig a little bit deeper into each one. So O is open questions, or also called open-ended questions. A is affirming. R is reflecting, reflexive thinking, and reflective statements. S is summarizing, and the plus refers to giving information or giving advice, but only with permission. So let's take a look at open-ended questions, affirming, reflecting, summarizing, and then giving information. So open-ended questions. These help you gather broader descriptive information. They facilitate dialogue. And just think about it by way of example. If you say to somebody, hey, did you have a healthy weekend of food choices? And the answer is yes or no. That's all the information you've gotten, right? You haven't opened up a dialogue or a environment, a space that shared information is going to take place. If you say, hey, describe to me what the weekend was like in terms of food choices. Well, wow, now you've just opened that door to this was good and this was bad and I felt great about this, I didn't feel so good about this. And now you've got all sorts of opportunities to look at self-efficacy, to exhibit empathy, all the things that we've been talking about. So open-ended questions, describe to me, using things like, how did it feel for you to exercise this past week? What was it like to go to a party that didn't have a lot of healthy food choices? So some of the cues are there on the slide. Using words like how and what, tell me about, and I use describe all the time, help us avoid those questions that we know we're going to get yes and no answer to, and that stops the conversation right there. A is for affirming. This goes a long way towards to expressing empathy and to exhibiting empathy. Simple statements like, wow, that sounds hard, or boy, you really made a great decision in a tough environment. Affirming their progress, really in whatever small little incremental ways it might be communicated to you, goes a long way towards establishing that rapport. It validates their experience, it validates their feelings, and it shows that you're listening, which is a perfect transition into the R, which is reflective listening. And I will say, before we even get to reflective listening, and certainly reflective statements, which I'll talk to you about, we have to make sure that we as coaches are doing reflective thinking. Are we listening, truly listening, or do we kind of have our own agenda? We're just waiting for the opportunity to tell them that really they should have been on the treadmill 30 minutes instead of 20 minutes or something like that. So reflective interesting serves two very important purposes. The first is to let that client know you're listening. You care about what they have to say. You're not just spacing out or waiting for your turn to talk. And the other important part of reflective listening and reflective statements is that it allows you to course correct if in fact what you're hearing is different from what that client intended. So if you say things like, it sounds to me like exercising in the morning is really not for you, or you're having a problem exercising in the morning, and that's not really what they meant, they only meant that that was the case on Fridays because they had to work late on Thursdays, then it allows you not to continue on with misinformation or misunderstood information. And the reflexive listening also sends that signal, what you're saying is important, and I'm listening to you, and I'm not just waiting for my turn to talk. So that's reflexive thinking, and then reflexive listening, and then reflexive statements. And the S, summaries, exactly what it sounds like. So it's kind of an extension of reflective listening and statements. It's taking a whole session or a chunk of a session, right, an interval, and simply summarizing it. It helps a client, again, understand that you're listening and paying attention and synthesizing. It helps you link their statements together kind of like puzzle pieces into the overall behavior change sort of framework. And it allows you to be listening for change talk. So change talk is talk on behalf of the client that really exhibits their willingness, their readiness to change, and ways that they've felt successful. So I went to the grocery store and I stayed on the periphery and I only put things into my cart that I felt were healthy. Well, when you summarize, you go back and you pull some of that change talk from the session and you reflect it back and you add it to your summary as a way of really celebrating those behavior change successes that person had as evidenced by their change talk. And the plus offering advice. This is a little tricky, I think, for us in the health and wellness and fitness industry because we have so much information and we want to share it. We can't wait to share it. We read a great article, we took a great workshop, we went to a great CEC course, and all we want to do is just share that great information. But I ask you, because I think it will land better to ask permission. I mean, it sounds kind of hokey, and the first couple times it feels a little bit weird, but you can say, especially if you've been putting into place all of the things that we've been talking about so far, you can say, would it be okay with you? Sounds like you have a great plan for this weekend. Would it be okay with you if I shared a few strategies on how to eat better when you're at a party, or have an enjoyable experience, exercise experience? And then less is more. So rather than hitting them over the head with a book of information, you can share with their permission some information. And this kind of came out of a study of motivational interviewing that some coaches felt a little bit sort of powerless, like, oh, but we want to share information, but if it's client-centered, how do we do that? And some of the later models of motivational interviewing have sort of allowed for this offering advice, as long as we're cautious about asking permission and making sure that it isn't just sort of our agenda all along to share information and that's it. And you absolutely need engagement. All of the things that we've talked about thus far must precede the asking to share information. So once you have that rapport, once you're dancing, right, and not fighting, then offering some carefully chosen information is perfectly fine. So let's talk about what I think is our biggest competition. I always tell fitness professionals, it's not the other trainer that's your competition. It's not the other club that's your competition per se. I think our competition is the pills, potions, powders, and diets that are out there that promise people a quick fix. And let me actually hold for a second on that idea of a quick fix. And we say to each other, we say to ourselves, so everybody just wants a quick fix. And I would argue that you're probably right. You're probably right that everybody wants a quick fix, because the alternative, everything that we're suggesting, getting up and exercising and making healthy food choices and managing stress and getting enough sleep, well, that stuff is really hard, right? So maybe they do want a quick fix because the alternative, maybe behaviors that for us might seem intuitive, like brushing our teeth, aren't intuitive for them. That's why we're talking about behavior change, because they're not currently doing those behaviors. And that's important. I think that we have to realize that everybody wants a quick fix, because the stuff that we're suggesting can be exceptionally difficult. So let's take a look at some of these diets and what they mean and what we think about them, and then we'll think about how to communicate that information to the people that we're coaching. So the reason that nutrition professionals and many fitness professionals and coaches don't love diets is because many of them are overly restrictive. They either take out a whole category of foods, or they take out a whole category of macronutrients, right? Usually carbs or fat these days. But the bottom line is that they are deprivation driven, they are very restrictive, and so what people do is they follow them for the short term, they're unsustainable, and then they stop following them, and then sort of who knows what happens. The second bullet on your slide says that 20% of dieters are successful. Well, let's flip that around. 80% of dieters are unsuccessful. And that probably has to do with how restrictive that diet is from the get-go. So I know a lot about diets. It's my world, it's my profession. So whether we're talking about paleo or keto or Ornish or low fat or low carb or any of the different protocols that are out there, if they are too over restrictive, people follow them, they go off them, and then the sort of pendulum swings in the other direction, right? It's I can't, I won't, I shouldn't, I can't, and then all of a sudden it swings like crazy over in the other direction and they can't stop. So long-term behavior change in many of these diets, and yes, I am lumping them all together for the purposes of this conversation, long-term behavior change is not addressed. So how do we talk to our clients about the quick fix without invalidating how attractive it might be to them? So the next slide talks about educating on diets. helping clients understand the temporary nature of a diet. And they might actually be open to the behavior change that we are hoping that they endorse. So I've given you some examples of questions to ask. And note, these are open-ended questions that we saw from the ORS acronym. So how might it feel for you to eat this way a few years from now? Or what might happen if you follow this until you lose weight, but then you go back to the way you're eating now? So what you're not saying is, don't you know that if you follow this diet, you're just going to, research shows that you're just going to gain back the weight and then some. That's a very different conversation than kind of exploring that discrepancy that we talked about, looking at ambivalence. Well, if you follow this for now, but then you go back to what you're doing, let's talk about what's going to happen. And in this way, you guide them towards the solution, towards coming up with a solution, as opposed to hitting them over the head with it. So if we're not going to follow a diet, and we're not going to recommend, or we're going to gently help clients understand that dieting might not be in their best interest, what are some of the behavior change components that we can kind of replace that dieting behavior with? So on your slide, you can see three, I think, unchallengeable tenets to weight management. We need a solid nutrition and exercise understanding, and at some point we have to share that or sort of demythify, tell fact from fiction for people, because there's so much misinformation around that's out there. We want people to have a positive attitude. And I think I would push that at the top of any list, because if people don't feel positive, they are not going to affect behavior change. And it's helpful if we can get to their motivation and also not invalidate a motivation that you might not share. So it might be that somebody wants to fit into a pair of pants. It might be that somebody wants to exercise with their grandchildren without getting out of breath. It might be that somebody wants to do a 5K or a 10K or some type of event. All of those things, if they're meaningful to that person, are completely valid in terms of their internal motivation. So listen for these motivators. Sometimes they're not even articulated in that way. You might just hear somebody really talking about rolling around on the floor with their grandkids and getting out of breath or not feeling like they can really keep up, and that should cue you to thinking, I bet this person would be motivated by something that has to do with their children or their grandchildren. So knowledge of nutrition and exercise, positive attitude, and dialing into that motivation are super, super important, and threads that should that we can tease through the rest of our conversation today. Like any behavior change, whether it's exercise or quitting smoking or managing substance abuse, these goals must be specific and measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And throughout the ACE materials, the ACE certification and specialty certificate materials, you will see those referred to and detailed in greater depth. And so I encourage you to look at some of those materials. They do a wonderful job at looking at goal setting, how important it is, and meeting each of those criteria. The shaping component on the slide there is really about just not focusing on the final behavior. That if we can get people to acknowledge and even celebrate successive approximations of the behavior, even if it isn't the final behavior, then we have made gestures and important gestures towards that behavior change. We like rewards, but we do have to sort of take a minute to note that they should be of a certain nature. They should be supportive of the overall behavior change goals. So for example, if somebody has made healthy food behavior choices that have resulted in weight loss, a reward shouldn't be, an unhealthy food. So taking time out for oneself, the slide has somebody relaxing and reading, even something like a massage, any type of reward that feels affirming but not in conflict with the overall behavior change goals that we're trying to reinforce. Self-monitoring is super important. We've known from loads and loads of research that food diaries and journals improve accountability and self-awareness and all that sort of stuff. Luckily now there's loads and loads of apps out there. I personally recommend apps so that I can log in and look at people's food journals if they're okay with it. What I wouldn't recommend by way of self-monitoring, remember we're talking about behaviors. And it's interesting that it's a course on a webinar on behavior change for weight management, but we're talking about behavior change. So weight loss isn't a behavior, right? Weight loss is the outcome of a set of behaviors that are changed in support of weight loss if weight loss is desired. So what I don't recommend in terms of self-monitoring are things that are not behaviors, right? That are things like weight. For years in my practice, I have weighed people backwards, meaning I see the number and they don't. It doesn't stress me out. It can derail some people, not everybody, but a lot of people. So when we're talking about self-monitoring, we're not talking necessarily about waist tapes or scale weights or things like that. We're talking about self-monitoring of behaviors that we're working to change. And in terms of that last bullet there, avoiding behavior change, I'm going to share an anecdote with you. I have a wonderful client. She's a Monday client. I love all my clients, but my Monday clients I sort of have a special place for in my heart and choose to share this story with you. Let's just call her Brenda. And so Brenda came to me on a few Mondays and she would say, boy, I don't know what's wrong. We make a plan, but then I go into the weekend and I have a terrible weekend of food choices, and then I come back here Monday and I feel sort of terrible because I haven't done anything that we agreed on. And so what we finally did is we traced those behaviors back. I said, just talk to me about what happened. You walk out of here on Monday and how are you feeling? And she's feeling good and affirmed and strong. And so she goes through her week and she tells me that on Thursday she has an early morning meeting at her office. And so she has to leave extra early from her home, rarely has time for breakfast, gets to the morning meeting, has the meeting, it's successful, and then a group of people kind of cluster around a coffee cart with donuts and have a sort of post-meeting meeting. And then she has a donut, even though she doesn't really want one. She has one because it's what everybody else is doing, and she's starving. And so then she feels terrible about having the donut. That causes her, in her reality, to make a lousy choice for lunch because after all she blew it for breakfast, and she's going to try to clean up her act by dinner, but by that time she does drive-through because breakfast and lunch have been terrible, and she'll start tomorrow, and then she gets to Friday, and who starts a program on Friday, and then she sort of traipses through the weekend not feeling terribly focused or self-affirming, and she comes in to see me on Monday. And so you can see from the slide, when we take that example, the prompting event or the instigating event really wasn't the weekend, right? The prompting event was that early morning meeting that she attended starving. And so we reworked that. We made a plan for having an egg sandwich that she made at home on the way to work. She then realized that there was somebody else at the meeting that she was having a similar challenge, and they posseed up and went for a walk after that morning meeting, so they just sort of avoided that coffee donut cart altogether. And just by kind of unlinking that chain, starting as early as possible in that chain, that prompting event, was really potent for her. It really made a difference then in what happened on Thursday and on Friday and on the weekend. And it really allowed her to replace the unhealthy behavior chain with a healthier behavior chain. So I encourage you to explore those behavior chains in people. Try to trace it back to the earliest possible point and see if you can replace that behavior with a healthier one, and then see what happens in the chain or the cascade after that. And we finish our discussion today with some practical tools. And by way of reminder, we're asking permission, we're developing the relationship. None of this final slide should replace any of the discussion that we've had so far today. But I do feel as a nutrition professional that I will share some of these with you, knowing that you will ask permission, knowing that you won't hit your clients over the head with this type of information, but also knowing that it's important. So modifying the home environment. I can't tell you how many clients do that kitchen cleanup and they take out all the unhealthy foods and then they don't replace it with any healthy foods. And so they're starving and they're really sort of no better off than they were before. I love if you don't put it in the cart, it won't go to the checkout, and if it doesn't go to the checkout, it won't go home. If it doesn't go home, it won't go in your cupboard. If it doesn't go in the cupboard, it won't go in your mouth. But the truth is that's the same for healthy food. You got to get it in your home so that it can be swapped out with the unhealthy food. And one might say the same for the work environment. I just gave you the example of Brenda in her work environment, but there's a wonderful study. It's called the Chocolate Kiss Study, and it's by a researcher. The study came out in 2006. The researcher is Brian Wansink out of Cornell. And what he did is he looked at a desk environment, a work environment. The study was only on women, and it had a transparent container filled with Hershey's Chocolate Kisses and an opaque container. And what do you think happened in terms of how much candy people actually took in? So when they had the clear container and they saw those kisses kind of calling at them, they ate 7.7 kisses per day. The opaque container, simply changing the opacity of the container, changing the visual, right, changing the cue, they didn't have none, but they had about half as many at 4.5. He did a second arm of the study, which did the same thing, but with the kisses 6 feet away, and that actually drove an improvement, but we saw the same thing. If they could see it in the clear container, they ate more than the opaque container. So that's sort of an extreme example, but I think modifying the work environment, modifying the home environment, can go a long way towards removing those triggers from people. Conscious eating is exactly what it sounds like. It's paying attention to eating. It's doing things like putting your fork down between bites. I actually ask my clients, if I've received permission, for them to, at least for a while, not eat with the television on, not eat while they're working on computers, so they can really be thinking, enjoying, tasting, enjoying, the food, and not sort of eating unconsciously. And I think that that is helpful. It's uncomfortable for some people at the beginning, but certainly a behavior change that, if that's the only thing they change, right, for a couple of weeks, can go a long way. Eating out, I think, is wonderful. I finished dinner with my son the other night, and I got a phone call from friends that were in out of town, and they said, "Hey, Dominique, can you come out to a restaurant and have dinner with us?" And I said, "Sure." And I thought, oh my goodness, that's my second dinner of the day. So I love eating in the company of my friends, but I do think that we can help people still maintain those healthy behaviors even in a group and eating out environment, though I agree that it does take some sort of different strategies at times. And exercise, what can we say, right? Here I am at ACE, the epicenter of evidence-based, holistic movement and exercise. We just got a new set of recommendations, of course, for exercise that we hope will make it a little bit more achievable for people. But exercise is more than just a caloric expenditure mechanism. There's a synergy, right? That people that exercise feel better, and when they feel better, they make healthier food choices, and they're able to manage their stress. Remember that wheel that we looked at? And while you can't change your genetics, you can certainly change a lot of those things on that wheel, and exercise goes a long way towards addressing many of them, including some of the hormones that we talked about. When people feel better when they're exercising, they make healthier food choices. And I would argue, as we get to that last bullet and towards the end of our discussion, a healthy attitude is incredibly important. I've long said that people don't feel bad enough into good behavior, right? They don't feel so bad that their behavior changes for the better. In fact, it usually works in the opposite direction, right? They feel bad enough into worse behavior, or, and let's turn that around, let's help them with all of what we talked about today, feel good enough into great behavior and behavior change. So I will leave you with those thoughts. I'm going to advance slides, and there are a couple of reference slides that I will hover on so that you have time to jot them down or to make note of them. There are two reference slides that I'll hover here for a second. And I encourage you to look at them, because there's lots more than what we were able to share here over the last hour. I hope some of you had a chance to write your questions in, because I look forward to answering them. And if you haven't, take a moment now to do that. And I will ask Jackie to come back up, and let's see if we have some questions.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
We do have some questions coming in. That was a lot of great information.
Super.
So I think it's helping people to, churn the brain a little bit and be thinking about all of this. So be sure to type your question in if you have something that you'd like to ask Dominique. In the meantime, while we allow those questions to come in, if you take a look at your slide, we have Dominique's contact information if you would like to get in touch with her. And we also have a Facebook chat that will be going on over the next few days.
Oh,
and
super.
So if we don't quite get to your question today that has been typed in, then Dominique can answer those over the next few days.
Happy to. That'd be great.
So that'll be on our ACE Facebook page as well. So make sure you type your question in here on our YouTube or on the Facebook after today's presentation. If you are interested in some of the information that was presented today, as we know this is only an hour-long discussion, and we could stay here all day, right? And talk about that. So we do have a lot more information to offer, and on your screen you can see 3 of the ACE specialist programs that we offer that cover a lot of the topics that we've talked about today. So behavior change specialist program, weight management specialist program, as well as our fitness nutrition specialist program. And all 3 of these have kind of tied together the behavior change, the fitness component, the nutrition component, and how we can work with our clients who are interested in weight management as well.
Super. Yep, they're great.
Yes. So we do also offer, and someone had commented on our live YouTube page about a workshop that we have. So we've spent an hour today talking about behavior change. If you'd like to spend 5 hours in a live workshop setting with your peers talking about behavior change and getting some real practical practice and conversations, we do have that as well, and that is under our continuing education events and workshops to find that workshop. Once again, if you would like some CECs, we have our new CEC club, so you can find more information about that on our website, acefitness.org. So let's take just a question or two here, and something that's been coming in, and I've seen a little bit of a trend here. People are curious about people that or clients that they have that might be having medications, right? That they've been prescribed medications from their doctor. So they're working with folks that have some of the diseases and things that you've mentioned as a result of maybe some poor behavior choices over a long period of time.
Sure.
So your role as a dietitian, a registered dietitian, serves a little bit different role than maybe a health coach or a fitness professional. So let's talk a little bit about that scope of practice and perhaps maybe working with clients that have that are being prescribed medications.
Sure. So there are an awful lot of people out there. We looked at that list, and the statistics are sort of staggering when we look at who's been diagnosed with diabetes or heart disease, and many of the interventions are pharmacological or drug-based. And so what I would say is that for all of those, lifestyle medicine or healthy lifestyle choices should be at the top of the list of interventions, and most healthcare providers know that, even if that person is also on medications. So I would encourage those coaches and fitness professionals to follow really ACE's guidelines for giving out nutrition advice, which is if you are following the sort of national authorities that are out there, if you are talking about healthy dietary patterns and not making specifics of single nutrients, and certainly if you're not talking about interactions with the drugs themselves, which is outside of scope of practice, but be willing, prepared, and energetic about sharing healthy nutrition guidelines for weight management with your clients, regardless of whether they're on medications. Learn more about them if you can, because I feel like more knowledge is good. But if you're sharing guideline-based, healthy lifestyle information, we hope they're getting it from their healthcare provider, but they'll be getting it from you.
Right. And so we want to be sure that we're staying within our scope of practice,
100%.
as you mentioned. And then if we do have clients that have those diseases, diagnosed diseases, maybe not prescribing anything, because that's not our role, right? And maybe referring them to someone like you.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. Either refer them to a registered dietitian who's used to working with those chronic conditions, things like diabetes or chronic kidney disease. Those are well within our scope of practice. But if it's just everybody else that's just trying to follow healthy nutrition advice, feel free to give it to them. And if you feel uncomfortable, there's probably a reason for it. And in that case, get a network of really good registered dietitians, nutritionists around you that you feel comfortable referring to. And who knows, for business purposes, maybe you'll get some referrals, maybe it becomes a referral source and you've just done well by that population.
Wonderful. So we could, again, spend a lot more time talking about how to work with those particular clients. And if you, as I said, would like to continue the conversation with Dominique, we will continue to ask her some questions on our Facebook page. That's the ACE Fitness Facebook page, and you can continue your conversation there with her and ask a few more questions. In order to receive continuing education credits for today's live webinar, take a look at your screen and you will see that you can find the recorded version of today's course on our ACE website, and you will do that by going to the Education and Resources tab and finding our live webinars page. Once you have purchased the recorded version of this course, the quiz will go into your MyAce account and you can pass that quiz with flying colors and then you'll receive 0.1 CECs within your MyAce account. As a reminder, you are watching today for free, so if you do want to review the information that you saw today, feel free to use the link and you can fast forward, rewind, pause, and restart this stream. But if you would like to receive CECs, you'll need to purchase them on our website. We also have another live webinar coming up next month, and we will be joined by one of our ACE Master Trainers, Garrett Stengel, who will be talking with us about how to use exercise strategies for clients with cardiovascular disease. So really important conversation that we'll be having with him next month. Make sure and sign up on our live webinars page, and we'll see you there. Once again, thank you very much, Dominique, for being here today as a member of our SAP board, our scientific advisory panel. Remember, we'll be chatting with you on our Facebook page over the next couple of days.
I will answer what I see. It's exciting, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. Important topic.
Great. Thank you so much. Remember to connect with ACE in a variety of ways via our Facebook page, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, every other way that you would like to connect with ACE, and let us know what you thought about today's course. Thanks for joining us. Let's get people moving.